We might start our first palette, which is Lost Memoirs. Lost Memoirs is really predominantly in the oranges and yellows. So I'll play the DVD for you now, and then I'll give you a bit more insight into that. This palette describes turning old objects into new masterpieces and celebrating the past. Be inspired by Nana, lovingly made handcrafts, patchworks, knitted objects, and even macrame. These are becoming cherished heirlooms, and the skills are now being passed on, with knitting classes over lunch breaks and cafes rekindling old traditions.
We are having back all the creative trends like knitting.
There's just been a big quilting exhibition in the UK, which is the history of quilts at the Victoria and Albert Museum, so that's how to kind of set off a whole trend in quilting.
The colours in this palette reflect nostalgia and keeping old traditions alive from one generation to the next. Celebrate your childhood and look into New Zealand's past with Fitzroy and Carterton, and celebrate old becoming new with Mangatanoka. So there we have our Lost Memoirs palette. Just to give you a feel, I mean, obviously these colours are quite bright. The way that you would use these colours from a New Zealand perspective is mainly in accessories. So these are sorts of the colours that are coming through, and when you see the storyboard, you'll see the actual colours. But certainly these are the colours that are coming through from Europe, and there's a lot of ceramics, there's a lot of glass, there's a lot of in fabrics as well we're seeing, and also the combination of the yellow and the orange together. Obviously patterns are very, very strong, and we recently saw some new material that just came in from the UK this week from one of the designers that does a lot of work with fabrics here, and she was really quite taken back by the colours and some of the association between the textiles and our colour forecast palettes, which is terrific. So a lot of the Lost Memoir palettes is really, the basis is done on the importance of handcrafts. We're certainly seeing handcrafts are just becoming more and more, I suppose, in fashion as far as general women's fashion. That's one of the key influences we look at, but also just in general society. There's been so many great examples of this, and one of the designers that we actually interviewed for the forecast, who showed his installation at Milan in April this year. His name is Adam Cornish. He's a very young designer, sort of up-and-coming designer based in Melbourne, and he was really taken back, I suppose, by a lot of this handcraft movement and what he saw in Milan. And the example that he gave was the jumper, and I'm sure a lot of you saw that by Established & Sons, by the Dutch designer Bergen Pot. You know, this fantastic chair. It was, you know, just your standard chair, and it had this knitting all over it, right down to the, you know, the bottom of the legs. And it just looks like something that, it was so individual. You could do anything with that and just make it feel as though it is your own. So those sorts of trends are just everywhere in Europe at the moment. The other interesting thing is recently I was just reading a newsletter at my son's school. My son goes to a school that's predominantly a boys' school. And I was reading about the knitting lessons at lunchtime, and I thought, knitting lessons at lunchtime? I can't believe it. And, you know, when I looked into it, I actually asked some of the senior boys, you know, I can't believe you've got knitting lessons at predominantly a boys' school. What's going on? And they said, well, you know, we don't know what this knitting thing's all about. You know, Mum doesn't knit, and we sort of haven't seen it, and we wanted to know what it's all about. I thought, well, you know, that actually just really stands to reason, because a lot of the research says that, you know, the younger generation, they're just not familiar with these sort of handcrafts that, you know, a lot of us sort of grew up with. Not that I can't knit, so I can't show my son, so it's good that they're doing knitting lessons at school. So this Lost Memoirs palette is all about rediscovering old objects and either restoring them or creating new masterpieces. It's about celebrating past nostalgic items and bringing them into contemporary environments. And the great thing about both New Zealand and Australia is how eclectic our taste is. You know, we love mixing old with new and finding, you know, old things on Trade Me and doing them up, restoring them, but bringing them into contemporary environments with new and modern furniture. It's a fantastic thing because obviously in our particular taste, we don't tend to like the themed environments, which is very much big in the US. So I'm just going to take you through some of our storyboard. And as I said, the colours don't really reflect the true colour. But just some of the items that we saw in our travels, just to give you an example, I mean, just in the time that we were mainly in Paris and London, we took over 1,200 photos, so there was a lot of culling that needed to be done. But some of the yellows that we're seeing through a lot more in kitchen products, certainly KitchenAid, and we saw a lot of the French brands as well in the yellows. We saw a lot more in really, as I mentioned before, in the nostalgic items. You know, here, in the Conran store, you know, an old cheese grater made into a lamp. You know, we saw lots of different examples of this. In one of our favourite little shops that we always go to every year is called La Collection in Paris. And they show a lot of new designers coming through, and not just from Paris, from all over the world. And they had these fantastic recycled lamps, I suppose you would call them, but they were just light fittings, but they were old jars, you know, and different shapes, different sizes, you know, just coming down off just a simple white wire. And they just look beautiful, you know, in a row. So those sorts of things we're seeing a lot more of as well, and we will go through an environmental palette, but, you know, the reusing the old things into design is becoming more so. Some of the interesting products we saw, this was just gorgeous. In Paris, you know, the old water fountain, you know, when you have the old plastic cups that you just used to squash when you were finished with them. You know, these cups, these are ceramic, and they came in a lot of different colourways. And they were just fabulous because everyone looked different. You know, you could just imagine someone, you know, in the mould. I mean, obviously these were mass-produced, but they just looked so handcrafted. They were absolutely brilliant. You know, we're seeing from candles, there's a lot of candles in lots of motifs, and we saw fish, we saw dragonflies, we saw butterflies, lots of natural sort of bugs, I suppose, as well as botanicals. And certainly in fabrics, a lot of birds still, and natural sort of leaves and that sort of thing in patterning.